Hey everyone, if you have an all-in-one cooler, you might have wondered where the radiator should go. Should it be at the top of your case, on the side, or at the front? And then, should the fans be set to intake or exhaust? Well, I've spent a bunch of time testing this, and many people would say you should put the radiator on the top of your case because warm air rises, but that's not actually correct. Sometimes mounting the radiator on the side can actually be best, but only if you're then really careful about the direction of all your other fans. So the general way I've tested in this video is that I've got a test computer in my garage with a Corsair 360mm all-in-one cooler. And then I'm using the Corsair Frame 4000D case because that allows you to put the radiator on the top, or the front, or the side. And for all of my tests I've run Firmark and OCCT just to max out the CPU and the GPU and really drive up those temperatures, and I know that the Ryzen 3600 that I've used in my test computer doesn't actually need an all-in-one cooler, but physics is physics, and everything I cover in this video will apply to you even if you've got a really high-end CPU. But with all that said, let's finally dive into the results so we can see the best mounting position for our radiators. And for this first test, I'm going to start off with the all-in-one radiator mounted to the top, and this obviously has 320mm fans, since this is a 360mm cooler. In terms of the airflow, I've also installed 2 front intakes, 3 side intakes, and then 1 exhaust, and the radiator fans are set to exhaust for this very first test, which is probably fairly normal for a gaming computer. And the airflow is all fairly standard too. We can see the air coming in through the 2 front intakes, and this air is then being brought across the motherboard, to cool the RAM and the VRMOS, and then the GPU will also benefit from having this cool intake air coming in as well. The side intake fans are also going to be bringing cool air in, and then this is again going to cool like the CPU and the VRMOS and the motherboard in general, and then that air is going to be exhausted out the back as we've seen so far. And you might have seen that there's a little bit of air turbulence happening here, and this can happen when you have 2 sources of intake fans really close together. In other words, the air from the front and the side intake fans are clashing together a little bit, but I don't think this is a major issue, to be honest. Airflow can get a bit complicated, and I'll come back to this point throughout the video, but the reason I say it's not a bad thing is that if we look at the temperature results, we can see that things are fairly healthy. So when adjusting for the ambient temps, both the CPU and the GPU are below 50 degrees Celsius, the VRMOS is 35 degrees Celsius, and our NVMe drive is at 25.52. And while, as I say, these are ambient adjusted temperatures, if you actually look at the absolute temperatures, the CPU and the GPU are actually doing fairly well, and they're below 70 degrees Celsius too, despite being maxed out. So that's a good starting point and a good baseline, but I've actually had some comments in the past from people wondering whether it's good to have as many sort of sources of intake air as possible near a radiator. In other words, if I flip the rear exhaust around and make it an intake instead, surely this will benefit the CPU temps, right? Well, the actual airflow looks fairly normal, with intake air coming in, and then this is exhausted out the top of the case as expected. But it does also look like there's a bit more air turbulence happening around the case, with much of the intake air moving around a little haphazardly in my opinion. The rear intake fan though is cooling the radiator straight away, so that looks good, but how does it affect temperatures? Well, it's not great. While the extra intake air is benefiting the motherboard components, with 5 degrees less in those, both the CPU and the GPU are performing worse. And granted, this is within the margin of error, but I do rerun these tests multiple times just to make sure that, a 1 degree difference is a legitimate 1 degree difference. And I think what's happening here is that taking away exhaust airflow has just been a bit of a negative overall, and I think that probably makes sense because we already had enough intake air in the first test, so removing a source of exhaust air isn't actually going to help the main components much at all, especially if the remaining air is then forced through the dense radiator fins and out of the case, instead of just coming out of a standard open case fan slot. In terms of static pressure, it's always better for air just to go out of an open slot than to go through an actual radiator with fin stacks and everything else. Next up, what happens if we flip the order of the fans on the radiator? So instead of exhausting air out of the case, they intake air through the radiator instead. Well, you could argue that since there's more intake air coming into the case, this will then clearly benefit the GPU and the motherboard temps. But of course we do still need some exhaust air, so I did flip the rear fan back to an exhaust. And in terms of the airflow, the front and the side intake fans do naturally continue to bring some fresh air into the system, and this is then exhausted out the back of the case as normal. We can also see that the radiators are now bringing fresh air into the case, but there are also signs of air turbulence, which again is not surprising considering we have so much intake air. Some of this air is also going straight out the back of the case, which is a bit pointless to be honest. And looking at the temps, this is the worst config so far. Both the CPU and the GPU are worse off with this configuration, particularly with the graphics card. And this probably makes sense because the graphics card has loads of warm air that's being pumped out the back of it, and then that warm air is sort of clashing with the cool air that's coming in through the radiator. So in other words, where the motherboard is, you've just got all this air clashing together. And yes, I know we got that rear exhaust at least, but there is still a lot of turbulence happening here. But before moving on, it's quickly worth comparing test 1 with test 3, the one we just done, since these had the same fan configs, but just with the radiator set to intake versus exhaust. And clearly, for the top mounted fan radiator position, it's better to set your radiator fans to exhaust. This is clearly helping both the CPU and the GPU temps. At this point now, I wanted to test other mounting positions for the radiator, so the front and the side and not just the top. I could have also moved the fans to the other side and then explored push-pull configurations, but to be honest, at this point there'd then be so many different permutations of tests that this video would turn out to be 2 hours long, but I will explore push-pull configs in a future video, so stay tuned for that. So for this next test, I've installed the radiator in the front, and I'm temporarily skipping the top fans altogether just to keep things simple, but I will add them back later. I've also set the radiator fans to be intake, so we have 6 intakes and 1 exhaust, and the airflow is fairly good, as you can see. The air at the front of the case is being brought through the radiator fins, and this cooler air is then helping to cool the GPU and the motherboard components before the air is exhausted out the rear. The side intake fans are also acting in the same way, with the fresh air coming in and then being exhausted out the case as we'd expect. And looking at the temperature data, victory! We have the lowest CPU temperatures so far, a massive 1.2 degrees Celsius different. Okay, that's not massive, but at least there is a difference there. Unfortunately, the GPU and the VRMOS is slightly higher, but at least we can see that the whole hot air rises, argument kind of breaks down here because we've moved the radiator away from the top and had a slight improvement in the CPU temps. And again, I run all these tests multiple times, so this isn't just sample variation. But for our next test, obviously we need to check for the front mounting positions. Is it best to have those fans set to intake or exhaust? Well, to test that, I removed the radiator and I flipped the fans around. So now, putting that back, we have 3 intake fans on the side and a total of 4 exhaust fans, 1 at the back and then 3 in the radiator. And as we can see, the radiator is definitely acting as an exhaust, with air being blown away here. The side fans are now the only source of active intake air, but unfortunately most of this air is being sucked straight out to the front of the case, which probably doesn't bode well for the actual temperature data, even though admittedly, some of this air is coming out the rear, is still not a really good sign. And the data proves that, so everything is higher than in our previous test. And while it is only 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, clearly in this configuration, our system is being starved of fresh airflow by having much of that side intake air just being sucked straight out of the case again. But at this point, surely if we just add more intake fans, that's going to solve the problem we just saw, and that's going to benefit temperatures throughout, right? So I got to work installing 2 new intake fans at the top of the case, meaning that we now have 5 intake fans in total and then 4 exhausts. And it does look like these new intake fans are helping, with more air moving around the case and then being exhausted out the back of the case than before, so that looks good. The side intake fans are continuing to mainly bring cool air in, that then immediately cools the radiator and that gets exhausted out the case. But maybe, actually having those top intake fans is going to help some of the other temperatures, right? Well, unfortunately, the temperature data doesn't really back that up. Everything is worse, sometimes decently so, with the GPU and the VRMOS being 3 to 4 degrees higher and the CPU being around 2.5 degrees higher. And while this might not seem to make immediate sense, it's worth going back to what I said earlier about air turbulence. Simply adding more fans doesn't necessarily mean lower temperatures. Sometimes it just means that more air is clashing around inside the case, which can then end up negatively affecting the natural or more optimal flow of air. In other words, sometimes just having air come in the front of the case, flowing over the components and then being exhausted out the back can be best. It's simple and it just works. But what about a side-mounted radiator position? Surely that's going to be easier and more consistent and get just better results overall, right? So for this next test, I set the radiator fans to exhaust out the case, leaving us with 5 intake fans and 4 exhaust in total, and some of the airflow is moving across the case and then cooling the graphics card before being exhausted out the back of the case, which looks promising. Some of the air is also being exhausted out the radiator, and you can see the air floating around behind the case. But it's actually a bit confusing from that camera angle, sorry, but I could actually see, the air was just aimlessly floating around, which is actually what we'd expect. The fact that there's then 2 intake fans nearby means that some of this warmer exhaust air is then being sucked back into the case, which is not ideal. And the reason I set those to intake and not exhaust was firstly so I could directly compare to the previous test, but secondly, if they were exhaust, the front intake air would then immediately be sucked out the case. So basically, fan configurations can have lots of weird nuances, and that's why I keep saying that less can be more. Anywho, looking at the temperature results, it's actually not that bad, thankfully. It's certainly far ahead of our last test, with most of the figures here being a few degrees or more lower, and the VR MOS being 7 degrees lower, which is good to see. And while that clearly is a good thing, this still isn't our best result overall. We had some front and top results which were better, so can we actually salvage side-mounted radiators to get better results? And that brings us to our next test, which might seem a bit balmy, but I wanted to see what would happen if we just had less intake fans overall, since I could tell that, air turbulence was a bit of an issue, so I was wondering if it was an issue as well in that previous test. So I unplugged the front intake fans, meaning that we ended up with just 2 intakes and 4 exhausts. And in terms of the airflow, we can see that the front intakes are now doing nothing, of course. So instead, air is only really being drawn in through the top of the case, and this is then helping to cool the GPU and the motherboard, and then this air is exhausted out the, front and the rear of the case. And while this is clearly an unconventional setup, at least there's no obvious signs of, air turbulence and air clashing and things like that. But unfortunately, the temperature results were bad. The worst so far, with most of the results being 5 to 6 degrees Celsius worse when adjusting for ambient temperatures. So that was a failed test, but let's actually go back to a more standard test config so we can actually look at the last but one test and directly compare those. And as a reminder, that particular test had 5 intakes and 4 exhausts. So for this new test, I then installed 3 intakes in the front, and then I switched the top fans to exhaust and I moved them backwards a bit so that they'd actually be exhausting properly. This means that we then have 6 intakes and 3 exhaust, which isn't the exact same fan config as the last but one test, but it's the same overall number of fans and it's the best for a head-to-head comparison, so that we can then better test whether it's best to have the radiator fan set to intake or exhaust. And looking at the airflow, the front intake fans do appear to be helping, with much of the air blowing across the case, helping to cool the VR MOS, the NVMe drives, the RAM and all of that, along with the GPU, and then this air is being exhausted out the top and the back of the case. There also thankfully doesn't seem to be much air turbulence caused by the fact that the side all-in-one cooler radiator fans are set to intake and not exhaust. Oh yeah, before I forget, I know the Grogu isn't here right now, but don't worry, I did test with and without Grogu, and it didn't affect thermals whatsoever. I just wanted to say that just to preempt any possible comments. Okay, thanks, bye. Anyway, looking at the thermals of this test, it's actually one of the best results. The ambient adjusted CPU temps are below 45 degrees Celsius, while the GPU temps are below 48 degrees Celsius. These two are actually some of the best results we've had, even if the NVMe and the VR MOS ones are slightly higher. Overall though, having a more standard fan config does seem to have benefited things here, and when the radiator is mounted on the side, it seems clear that the fan should be set to intake because this delivered lower CPU and GPU temps. And with all these videos, I do get lots of comments saying, why didn't you test this specific thing? But yeah, in this particular video, I just wanted to actually test with, mounting the radiator on the front and the side and the top, because that's going to cover like 95% of people's actual setups. But please do leave suggestions in the comments for what you'd want to see in a future video, and as I mentioned, I will look at push-pull in a future video too. But before wrapping up, I had 2 main things to talk about. So firstly, if you want to put your all-in-one radiator in the front or the side of the case, then in general, setting the fans to be intake is probably going to be best. And yes, this can vary depending on your case and your hardware, but this seems to be the best overall because the radiator gets cooled quite quickly. In other words, it's going to deliver lower CPU temps. Whereas if you were thinking of mounting your radiator in the top, then setting the fans to exhaust will probably work well because all that warm air will just be pushed out the case. However, my second point is it's never that simple and there's always going to be trade-offs. With a top-mounted all-in-one cooler, the warm GPU air will be pushed through the radiator. So in other words, in a top-mounted config, the GPU is probably going to benefit more than the CPU will, while with a side or a front-mounted all-in-one cooler, the CPU will get cooled immediately, but then the air inside the case is going to be warmer and that's then going to be worse for the GPU. So if your priority is gaming and having a cooler graphics card, then mounting your radiator to the top might actually work out best, even if this leads to slightly higher CPU temps. But really, a lot of these results are quite close to each other, so as long as you, do fairly normal things, then just try not to worry about it too much. You're not going to see a massive difference, and sometimes the mounting position can come down to your own preferences and your case aesthetics and things like that. But I'd love to hear from you down in the comments, so let me know what you think of all of this, and if you enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up button, and please subscribe to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.